Hello and welcome to episode 32 of AS for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm speaking today with architect Craig Hamilton about his body of work in the classical tradition, particularly his sacred architecture, design that, according to the architectural historian Gavin Stamp, demonstrated that classicism can be resourceful, appropriate, and in its own terms, truly original.
The purpose of the Greek temple was to house a deity, no other purpose. So that when we came to the design of Column, Sandy and I, Alexander Stoddart, had always had this idea that we might somehow replicate, through the centuries, we might replicate this idea of a deity seated in a sacred building, irrespective of the age, irrespective of the religion. It's this constant idea of housing the deity in a beautiful building that has been made with such inordinate care, so that every bit of craftsmanship that's been put into this building has transformed the materials out of which they're made to such an extent that when you look at it as a lay person, you can scarcely believe that that's come from a piece of wood or it's come from a piece of metal. And why should such care have been taken?
A's for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to the architect Craig Hamilton. Craig, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Craig Hamilton. I'm not sure what else I can say other than I'm an architect, and I have devoted my last sort of 40-odd years to traditional and classical architecture, both the sort of understanding of it and the making of it.
Okay, that's a nice, clear. That's possibly the shortest introduction anybody has given. That's a very, very humble introduction. So I wanted to speak to you. I've used your work in my teaching. I teach a cultural context course, one of the areas of which is to do with tradition.
Yeah.
Tradition and authenticity, which are sort of bundled together. But I've noticed also in my students, there's always an interest, if not there's always an interest in traditional architectural forms, and particularly increasingly around ideas of ornament, decoration, and kind of the symbolic languages possible within architecture. And you see this emerging even in contemporary modernist architects. And I just wondered if you could start off by explaining and describing your journey towards classical architecture, where you trained, how you trained, and whether there was a kind of Damascene moment for you where you moved away from perhaps what you were trained in towards this new language.
Well, I had an old-fashioned architectural training in South Africa in the late 70s and 80s. And I say old-fashioned in the sense that we were taught architectural history to a very deep degree. And we were taught history as a sort of great treasury of ideas that we could draw on. So when we were designing a town square, we would set the precedent of looking at town squares from history. So it became very clear to me. It never really struck me as being anything other than absolutely normal to be looking backwards in order to produce one's designs. And we were taught how to use sketchbooks. We were taught to measure buildings. We were taught life drawing, we were taught the classical orders, to a very simple degree, not as anything that we might really use, but we were nevertheless taught them. We knew what they were and we knew how they functioned. And I was blessed by having a very wonderful tutor called Professor Barry Bierman, who was a modernist, but who was steeped in the classical tradition and valued the exercise of looking hard at the past. And he was really a great mentor and someone who I admired very much, the way he relied on sketchbooks, which he used as his own reference materials constantly. So I was blessed by an old-fashioned tradition. For various reasons, I left South Africa in the early 80s and came to the UK. Knew all along, having done, I probably need to say that I spent a year in the Himalayas and partly in the UK, looking in the Himalayas at vernacular architecture of the Buddhists, both in Nepal and Western Himalaya. A rather unusual thing to do. And then I came to the UK and I looked particularly at Lutyens and Hawksmoor, their work. For several months, going out on a bicycle and with my sketchbook and recording, and it really was just an instinct, and I followed my instincts, all the way through. So by the time I'd left university, I knew that I wanted to practice, but I wanted to practice being an apprentice to an architect who had some inclination towards traditional architecture. And I secured a post with an architect called Michael Reardon in Warwickshire, who was a sort of contextualist, I suppose, responsible for the Swan Theatre. And I had 5 years with him. He was cathedral architect to 4 or 5 cathedrals. So I had a sort of conservation background. I knew I didn't want to be a conservation architect, but I wanted to learn how traditional vernacular buildings were actually physically made and put together. So there was a very, very good grounding indeed. I was also thrown in the deep end in terms of design, and that was a very useful exercise. But my path towards classicism really came through the vernacular, having been born and bred in farming territory in Southern Africa, where the colonial house with its verandas so wonderfully responded to the landscape and to the conditions. It just seemed to me a natural way of designing. And I also had the pleasure of meeting Geoffrey Bower. I don't know whether you know of Geoffrey Bower.
Yes.
In Sri Lanka, I made a pilgrimage to meet him in the early 80s, and he was terribly, terribly kind to me. And we corresponded for really up until the point he had his stroke, when he was rendered unable to communicate any further. And I had a great joy of sending him some photographs of the first building that I designed. And so, and what I admired so much in Geoffrey Bower as a practitioner was somebody who was able to take the language of his native land and reinvent it and refresh it and re-understand it and repurpose it, for a vast range of commercial, residential, institutional buildings. So I was blessed really by having him as a sort of second mentor. And then through my early practice with Michael Reardon, obviously I realized that I needed to learn a lot more about the Western tradition. And so I sort of buried myself in endless travels and endless measuring expeditions with my sketchbook over many years. I started on my own in 1991, so that's more than 30 years ago, as a sole practitioner, and became even more and more convinced that there was, because by that time I realized that there were clients who wanted this kind of architecture, so there was still, a relevance. The coming to the high game, what Lutyens called the high game of classicism, was just a sort of natural progression out of the vernacular. And the vernacular, it's interesting because classical architecture sort of comes out of the vernacular, and so and there are many ways of coming to classicism, but to come through the vernacular, I think is a good way, because you learn about the importance of materials and how they're used, and craftsmanship, how things are made. My father is a cabinet maker. Bless him, he's ancient, but he's still attempting to make a wonderful cabinet maker. So I was brought up in a workshop, basically, enjoying that activity of physically making something and seeing how materials put together. And then I suppose with endless trips to Europe, in particular to Italy, the high game of classicism became more and more of an obsession, how the great dead heroes of the past, or once great friends and supporters from the past, were able to point one in ways of solving particular problems, and also giving one a huge amount of courage in terms of how at each stage the so-called canons of classical architecture were broken, and for various reasons, in order to fulfill various functions or to simply find a different way of expressing, for example, Michelangelo's work. And so one realized that the language of classical architecture was sort of infinitely variable and infinitely capable of refreshing itself. A sort of constant evolution. I was making trips to antiquity, to Greece, to Rome, and then looking at the Renaissance. And then, thanks to Gavin Stamp, who is the third mentor who I'd have to mention, who was hugely important in my education as an architect, really kindle my already awakened interest in more contemporary classicism. By that I mean early 20th century classicism and the golden age in America and the golden age in the UK between the wars, before and between the wars. And also across Europe, all those obscure figures that we've all forgotten about, the other part of architectural history that was lost as a result of what happened after the Second World War, and the sort of grip that modernism managed to hold on the whole sort of profession. And so Gavin gave me hugely generously suggestions endlessly of who to look at, which architects to look at in their work. And I realized just how broad a church and how wonderful repository of ideas there are out there. European people like Plečnik, for example, is a great hero. And in America, obscure people like Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue. These are, and in the United Kingdom, people like Giles Gilbert Scott, who was able to work in both the Gothic and the classical idioms in wonderfully monumental. So that, I suppose, encapsulates my sort of education and my coming to an understanding of how glorious a tradition it is to be part of, to work with.
That's fantastic. Very rich picture. I mean, what a series of mentors. I want to ask you about Professor Bierman, but I suppose it would be useful. You've described classicism as a broad church.
Yeah.
How, if one were to have to describe it simply, what differentiates, say, classicism from the vernacular? So if the vernacular is very much a kind of a situated and responsive cultural and climatic and material endeavor, what is how does the classical build on that, and what is it?
Well,
because it's more than just putting pilasters on things. It's more than just using the orders, because otherwise every suburban house built by, I don't know, Whitney Holmes would be a classical building.
Yes, indeed. Well, Vitruvius in his 10 books, said that there are three things that architects should pay attention to: firmness, commodity, and delight. Mm-hmm. And of course, delight is the issue, which is where building becomes architecture. And so I think that's where the high game of classicism, I hate to use the word intellectual, because it's more a sort of perceptual language that one works with and learns, rather than a language of words. It's a visual language of elements. And that's where I think, coming out of the vernacular, I felt that almost embarrassed to enter the high game at an early stage, because I felt that it was perhaps a little bit self-conscious thing to be doing. But then I realized, looking at the work of people like Michelangelo, for example, how by the challenging of a previous canon, one was able to express something which is profound. And particularly as I began working on sacred architecture, I realized the power of what you can do just by placing two columns a little closer together than had been previously perhaps considered. So I think, but one can't get to the point of the high game until you've had a very, very thorough understanding of the language. It needs to be profound, and you need to have humbly looked at so much work before you can really begin to, and I'm not saying that I've even got anywhere near that, but it's a process that does involve looking so hard so that when you do come to the drawing board, that you can almost forget what you're thinking about at the time. If you know what I mean.
I do. Yeah, I do. I think this is really lovely, and this comes back to a phrase. There's a lovely video of you on YouTube, which I will link to in the podcast description, which you did with the Architecture Foundation, where they came to your beautiful home, Coed Mawr.
Yeah.
By the way,
where I am now.
I think I've got the pronunciation right, because obviously it's in Welsh, so it's a slightly
Coed Mawr,
Coed Mawr. And you mentioned in there this lovely phrase of about the monuments you have, the memorials you have in your garden, one to Shinkel and one to Bierman as well. And you've just mentioned it again, this idea of having great friends of the past. You talked about honoring the dead, and you talked about having great friends of the past. And so this classical model, this classical architecture is, in a way, you are a mark in a continuum. Rather than a
linear. I think modernism is about a sort of revolutionary linear progression, whereas classical architecture is much more an evolutionary process and circular. I feel it's a sort of dialogue with the dead, for the sake of the unborn. So that I'm walking around the streets of Venice, and I bump into an architectural detail, and I think, that's Sansovino. And it's that sort of constant dialogue with the dead that is just so helpful as an architect, because all these problems that are presented to us have all been, presented in one way or another to previous architects and been solved beautifully. So it gives one huge courage, and I think that's one of the things that young students miss out on if they are not introduced to this tradition, that they don't realize that it's the way tradition develops is through the dialogue with the past, and then using that knowledge to help you as crutches, really, to get to the next point, to solve the next problem. And so it should be seen as not something that's mysterious, but really that's something that is a tremendous help. It's we were taught the business of a column. One of the reasons I left Michael Reardon's office was that it was verboten. In other words, it was forbidden to use a column, a classical column. And why should we limit ourselves, to not being able to use this language when it's so, it's so all pervasive in our society, and it shouldn't be mysterious. It should be like French or Italian. We should be able to learn it if we wish to and apply it. And it also helps, because you realize that you're amongst colleagues, surrounded by colleagues all the time, and you're not on your own. You're not trying to reinvent the wheel the whole time. You know, you're just trying to. When I'm designing a church, I'm trying to recreate that feeling that when I step over the threshold of a wonderful Renaissance cathedral or the temple threshold, in Basai, I'm trying to recreate somehow that experience in what I do. It's a question of wanting to recreate, knowing that you cannot possibly recreate it because the circumstances are so different, and the site is different, and the client is different, and the orientation is different. But it's that constant desire to extend the tradition that is so for me so inspirational, really.
Yes, this idea of the extending of the tradition. I mean, I was reading some of the articles that you have on your website from the architects Ellis Woodman and Gavin Stamp, like that, who have talked about your work in great detail and with great sympathy as well, and if in Gavin Stamp's case, a great deal of admiration. But I was interested. You said at the beginning, Professor Bierman, was a modernist.
Yeah.
I assume he was a modernist in the early 20th century style of being a modernist rather than in the contemporary idea of being a modernist, because the early 20th century modernism was infused by a kind of sense of order and a sense of abstract and absolute values, which are also characteristic of classical architecture. There's an idea there that there is something that is true, something that is good, and something that is ultimately beautiful. Whereas perhaps contemporary modernist architecture is much more ad hoc, much more subjective.
I agree with you, and he was trained in the 1940s, just after the Second World War. Was obsessed with modernism in Brazil, and as a student took a boat to Brazil and did a wonderful essay on the fenestration, the idea of fenestration in Brazil, and of course he had a classical training, as did Le Corbusier, as did all the early classics. Mies van der Rohe. I mean, he was actually, his early houses are wonderful, stripped down, Schinkel-esque buildings. So, I always say I prefer my modernists trained as classicists because that sense of order, that sense of understanding of the classical, that's why I think it's so important that the classical language is taught, in modernist schools of architecture, because there are so many early modernists in America. Paul Cray, for example, who I admire very much, and also the Scandinavian modernists who came out of a richer classical tradition, and who then stripped it back to something more rational, and Löwritsen and Asplund and people like that. So. And Bierman was somebody who didn't practice very much, but the few buildings that he did do, his own house, for example, were actually steeped in the vernacular and the classical vernacular, with lots of references, lots of cultural references. I think you spoke earlier about ornamentation and how your students are so fascinated by the use of ornamentation, which has been so it's been so difficult to employ as an architect through the 20th century. Well, I think those early modernists were making extensive use of cultural references, which is the thing that gives a buildings a narrative and a joy. All the things that we as lay people love so much, and I think it's coming back with modern architects as well. It's this idea of making specific cultural references to the past, and not being afraid of an arch, not being afraid of a column, and so I'm encouraged by all of that.
I mean, you see it in the work of people like David Chipperfield, even who sort of come to the art as a kind of austere, slightly po-faced modernist. But really, I live in Margate, and we have our Turner Contemporary designed by Chipperfield, and it, even though the building itself is a sort of industrial vernacular modernism, you can see the classical languages kind of.
Yes.
Inside every decent modernist building is a classical building screaming to get out, kind of thing.
Yes, I mean, I suppose it's and I've looked hard at the strict classicism as well, and I admire it, and I've indeed worked in that idiom. But there's always a balance to be struck between the joy that you get from making cultural references and using materials in a decorative way, and also the idea that architecture is the mother of the arts, and that it has these two wonderful children. It has a beautiful daughter who's painting, and has a very naughty but favored child, the son, who's sculpture. And the admission of these two children into the building give voice to the building. It's what it's what the 19th century architects described as giving a voice to the building, and that's been so ignored, I think, as an integral part of when you think of temples from antiquity, where the deity, the sculpture was the purpose of the building rather than the building. So I think there's there's still a long way to go in order to free us from all of those preconceived ideas that we could no longer, work, with the rich associations that classical architecture brought us. I mean, there are no rules. One can choose not to, but I think one should be able to choose to. If you and I sense we're heading, closer to a more liberal, acceptance of that way of working.
But certainly, I mean, in the end, the market is always right, isn't it? The client is always right. So if people ask for it, it will get built. And in your case, they do ask for it. So in a way, that's evidence of it itself. I was thinking about this idea of the turn towards, so you mentioned a sort of chaos in the post-war years, and this complete abandonment of that other modern tradition that had emerged in the 20th, early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah.
And I suppose what modernism was trying to do was to develop, well, for a start, it was trying to turn over the apple cart of a culture that had failed to protect itself, and had, through industrialization and through industrial warfare, had enacted great horrors across the world.
Yeah.
And I suppose that the throwing out of classical architecture was part of that whole thing, that we needed a new way of being architects, and we needed to be ethical. We needed to be effective agents for social and political change in the world. And I didn't want to talk about politics so much, but I did wonder, and it was again something that Ellis Woodman touched on. He wondered at the end of one of the articles you have on your website, from I think probably The Guardian, although I'm not sure. How would an architect like you, how would a classical architecture engage with the contemporary condition, which is, I mean, very different now from the post-war one, an age of incredible hybridity, mass movements of people, synthetic demographics, and some very particular social issues. So if modernism is an attempt to create an ethical architecture, which it then abandons classical architecture as antithetical to that, then how does classical architecture do good? And I admit this question is a little bit ridiculous, but I think it's a question that a lot of people.
Well, I think the answer lies in history, and it lies in all those wonderful places all over the United Kingdom, all over Europe, all over America, all those classical buildings that people are still 1,000 years or 500 years later still living in and working and enjoying and loving. Mm-hmm. Why should human beings not still enjoy? One doesn't. The Georgian facade, for example, of a Georgian terrace was at the time a very economical way of building en masse, and it turned out to be actually a rather clever way and rather humane, arranged around big squares. So I think we've got endless lessons to learn from classical architecture in terms of, because the human condition doesn't change that much in terms of what we require. We need firmness. We need commodity. We need something that's fit for purpose, but we also need delight. So there's so many examples. Lutyens in his last years at Vincent Street did a wonderful set of social housing building. You probably know it's in Westminster, the great blocks around beautiful squares, where the only ornamentation is the sort of entrance doorway, and then it has these great squares of brick and stone stepping their way around the facade. So I think the lessons of the problem with the 20th century was that the great ghastly regimes were all favored classical architecture. So Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin until 1956 when he died, they were pushing classical architecture, and so classicism was thrown out, and that was partly the reasons that you've given, but also it was it was supposedly a language that was not humane, but it's quite the reverse. Everybody, as you say, wants to go to Italy and to the hill towns of Italy, or they want to sit in the wonderful squares. And that comes out of the classical tradition, and that's not going to change. The human condition is, of course, architecture can be used in an authoritarian way against human beings, but the buildings, the language itself is an intensely humane language. Why aren't we building more squares like Bedford Square in London for with simple, beautifully proportioned, simple with materials that will last for 1,000 years. We're living in times where climate change is at the top of our priority, and the buildings that last 1,000 years are surely going to be the buildings that are going to be judged as being most sustainable. And so I think it's got tremendous relevance. As classical architects, we get very, very few. In this country, we get very few opportunities. I'd love to have the opportunity to design a school or a hospital. Gosh, there's this wonderful hospital, classical hospital, when you think of a school. It's all ranged around courtyards usually, which is usually illegal these days. But so I think it's just that there classical architects have not been given the opportunity. The opportunities we've had have been in the sort of country house areas. We don't get public buildings. Largely speaking, we don't get public buildings. Some commercial work, and some sacred, a little bit of sacred work. But there's a whole. I teach a bit at Notre Dame in South Bend, and also I help a little bit at Kingston. And there are students there who are tackling all of the social problems at the moment with the classical language in such interesting ways. So I think we just need to give classicism, traditional architecture, a chance to have a go at it. I mean, the modernists have had a go at it, and I think in some cases failed very badly. In other cases, they've done perfectly okay.
Yeah.
But it's not the language that's at the fault. It's how it's implemented, how it's used.
I'm minded of there's a very good architectural history book, art history book by E.H. Gombrich called The Preference for the Primitive, in which he talks about how, tracing back to antiquity, talks about how there is this cycle of over time, there's always this cycle towards winnowing away what is seen as being decadent. So the sort of Art Nouveau or fin de siècle architecture of the late 19th, early 20th century is seen as being an instance of excess, which modernism clears away, but in a peculiar kind of way. As you say, the high-tech version of modernism that we now embrace is extremely baroque in its logic.
I agree.
It's extremely energy intensive in every single component of its production. And,
I agree.
And so there is this argument now, perhaps, because you've talked about this in that video that I mentioned from the Architecture Foundation, and also in a lovely essay you wrote about your inspiration of the Thorsveld, is it Thorsveld Museum?
Thorvaldsen Museum, yeah.
Thorvaldsen Museum,
yeah.
It's a terrific building, but the word that keeps coming to mind when you're talking is this, the one that you picked out before, the third of Vitruvius's pillar, which is delight. And there's this idea of delightfulness which permeates all of your buildings. And you mentioned it also in the when you touched on this idea of art and the integration of art and architecture, which is again something that's quite, I wanted to, a little bit, and your house, of course, is a prime example, but so also is the chapels that you've built, for example, Culham Chapel.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit perhaps about that relationship between art and architecture, as you know, is the good daughter rather than the naughty son.
You mean painting and architecture?
Well, I mean,
or sculpture, more.
I mean, both of these things. Go on.
No, I mean, I just, I spent my life drawing from an early age, and I live with the most wonderful painter. My wife is a wonderful painter. So it just seemed to me that a natural thing to do, to simply at the outset of a project to actually think about how the architecture might be inhabited by art and architecture, and also if one spends so many hours with wonderful craftsmen in workshops, you realize that their potential can be let loose on your building. It's wonderfully exciting, and but I've had the great joy of working with Alexander Stoddart, who is a neoclassical sculptor of great genius, as great as Thorvaldsen, a man of huge intellect, who I respect more than anybody else artistically alive today. What I've learned through that experience is that the architecture is hugely, you benefit enormously in the design if you involve the artists at a very, very early stage. And I've had that opportunity because, as I was saying previously, Greek temples were, the purpose of the Greek temple was to house a deity, no other purpose. So that when we came to the design of Culham, Sandy and I, Alexander Stoddart, had always had this idea that we might somehow replicate through the centuries, we might replicate this idea of a deity seated in a sacred building, irrespective of the age, irrespective of the religion. It's this constant idea of housing the deity in a beautiful building that has been made with such inordinate care. so that every bit of craftsmanship that's been put into this building has transformed the materials out of which they're made to such an extent that when you look at it as a layperson, you can scarcely believe that that's come from a piece of wood or it's come from a piece of metal. And why should such care have been taken? If one has any religious feeling in one body, it's really as a result of the art that one has experienced in buildings. And it seems to me just a natural instinct to continue that tradition. And I think if it's done with huge care and done with huge sensitivity, and with after years and years of study and looking and paying homage and done respectively, with great respect for the past, then it doesn't always produce beauty, but it stands a very good chance. And it's valuable. You know, the little chapel at Culham is open to the public. It has memorial services. It has mass once a month. It now has quite a congregation that joins it, and they come there astonished by what's been done and wonder why this can't be done more often. And it's not only to do with cost; it's got to do with the integration of art and architecture, how one can produce this, and what the Germans call a Gesamtkunstwerk. And I would just really encourage, many more architects to think in this way, because when you look at the work of the early 20th century schools of architecture and painting, they work together. So students would produce a project, a town hall, and they'd work with the sculpture students and they'd work with the painting students, and the painting students would do frescoes. I mean, the Slade had a whole school of fresco painters, of people who was people like Winifred Knights, Colin Gill, Kingsley Lawrence, Brangwyn. What's happened to our tradition of frescoing walls? All I'm saying is that these are traditions that need to be revived. They bring great joy. They bring great employment as well. And I think we're missing a trick. I really think we're missing a trick.
No, I agree. And I think it's really interesting that you're talking about the integration of these two things, because I think that's where people struggle. I remember reading I think it was a Leon Creer article when I was studying, which must have been 2 decades ago. Well, I mean, I was studying 2 decades ago. It must have been, the article was written around that time, where he was talking about sort of architecture as almost like theatrical sets against which the activity of the world takes place. And I like this idea, but I'm kind of fascinated by this idea of creating buildings that go beyond the kind of contemporary gallery. Contemporary galleries have a tendency of trying to be sort of didactically anonymous.
Neutral.
Neutral, but in an aggressive way. I think that's what.
I agree.
It's not a genuine neutrality as far as I can read. But you're this lovely idea of generating integration and this symbiotic relationship between the artist, sculptor, painter, fresco maker, and the architect is a lovely radicalism. And you do see it a little bit in certain contemporary architects like Caruso St. John, for example.
Yes, indeed. I admire their work, very much. No, I just know from my own experience how rewarding it is to work in this way. And it is, just continuing that tradition that starts way back when the temples of antiquity were painted, and then through the Renaissance, obviously it reaches an absolute zenith. But then it re-emerges again in the early 20th century, and then and then sort of dies out.
Mm.
And it survives a little bit in sacred work, because we all need crutches in order to help us, and we can't survive on thin gruel that modernists throw up at us every now and again, for sacred work. So it has survived through. But
there's a beautiful church up in Rochdale, of all places, called St. John the Baptist, which is done in a sort of.
Yes, I know it.
Do you, with absolutely exquisite Oppenheimer mosaics?
Mosaics, indeed. Yes, yeah.
And
there's a very similar one in Droitwich, which very few people know about, which is a great sort of Byzantine wonder that comes, out of that tradition of Boris Arnrep from Westminster Cathedral. All the work that was done there, and the Catholic tradition has kept that going to a certain extent. Westminster, in particular, with the tradition of trying to get the mosaics done in the cathedral.
I want to move on to talk about your sacred work, because obviously that is, as I said, possibly Culham is possibly your most well-known building so far. But you've done 3 Catholic chapels, and the sacred. I wrote my master's dissertation on sacred architecture, and I probably give you shivers, but I was research assistant on a book on looking at modernist Catholic church architecture in Britain.
Yeah,
and I travelled round to all of the post-war suburbia in the UK and photographed small and slightly less small. Very interesting, but shall we say? I think interesting is the best.
No, I mean, there are some very interesting work.
Yeah, but I suppose it would be really nice. So you've talked about this idea of the universal language of the sacred. But for perhaps the British context, and I'm living down near the site where Pugin came from.
Yes.
Gus Pugin.
His own house.
I mean, the Grange, it's absolutely wonderful. And he is an absolutely wonderful, Titan. Didn't see classicism as particularly related to what he saw as native Christian liturgy, and possibly also sacred architecture generally. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way that classical languages particularly perform as sacred spaces, liturgical spaces, particularly Christian liturgical spaces. For example, your work is basilica-like, is it not?
Yes, indeed. Well, the early Christians were totally immersed in the classical world. We mustn't forget, the Hellenistic world, the Roman world. They use fragments of the Roman world in their own work. They took over spaces. They took the idea of the basilica, which is a non-sacred space, and made it into their own. So one thinks of the Acropolis, where the temple became at once a mosque, followed by a Christian church, and so it just seemed inevitable to me that there's a place, and particularly in the Catholic tradition, for a very strong place for the classical use of the classical language. I'm not saying that I love the Gothic language. In fact, at Culham, I made all sorts of references to the Gothic tradition in the work of John Francis Bentley at Westminster, and also little references to Ninian Compa. And of course, Compa, you will know, had 2 phases in his career. He begins with the sort of unity of exclusion, where he excludes everything else. And then he finishes up, before he dies, with the idea of unity of inclusion, where he includes classical and Gothic elements in his work. Anyway, I'm digressing slightly, but it just seemed to me that the simple basilica form is one which has been used through the centuries from early Christian times.
Mm-hmm.
And here in the United Kingdom as well.
But would you like Wren be tempted to, or be forced, be willing to be forced to produce a cruciform church? You know, obviously, at St. Paul's, he does this kind of strange amalgam of Gothic and
much criticized. Yeah, so the question is whether I would mind being told to design a Greek cross church. I'd love to have the opportunity rather than a Latin cross church. I mean, I think as architects, we're just servants, and if I was told I needed to do Greek cross, but in the Gothic mode, but Gothic CK, that'd be okay. I mean, I'm a stylist, I can do it all. I mean, I'm not very good at modernist stuff, but I could do any of the others, and that's, I think, where one sort of differs slightly. One takes great joy in learning a different part of the language and then applying it. It's
how does that differ from the postmodern?
Well, I sort of don't know a huge amount about postmodernism, but I do admire some of the proponents. John Outram, for example, at the moment, who's just having a proper reappraisal now. It's not. I don't think it's vastly dissimilar, except that the language is perhaps slightly less refined. So one is using the sort of elements, but in a very I don't want to use the word crude, but sort of elemental manner, where it's applied perhaps without the full refinement of a full classical training. But then, there are many provincial 16th century Italian architects who are working in the same sort of way, and produces a sort of slightly naive, sometimes wonderfully interesting. And I think postmodernism was very, very important in terms of reintroducing us to color, to decoration, to making cultural references, not being afraid of these things. I think we're going to come to learn just how important it really was. My own work, I try and create a sort of synthetic whole. By that I mean where one has absorbed these references to such an extent where they do achieve some sense of unity. One thinks of the work of Charles Robert Cockerell, who's a great hero of mine, and the Ashmolean, for example, where he uses the Palladian. He sort of merges the Palladian with the Greek in a way which just looks inevitable. It looks as though, and that's how I think tradition develops. It sort of goes through these awkward phases where it looks as though objects from different periods have been bolted on together through less skillful operators. But when you get somebody with the skill of Cockerell, then it suddenly becomes a new language. And it's been spoken in a completely fresh way. And that's what's so, opposite Euston Station in London, there's a group of commercial buildings by Beresford Pite, Greek revival from sort of 1890s. And they just take your breath away. Here is somebody who has just completely refashioned the language. But there are so few out there who are able to do that really successfully, and I don't count myself amongst them. But that's one's aim. That is one's aim, is to not self-consciously but unsubconsciously use one's knowledge and experience and produce something which is at once fresh and at once familiar. One's trying to square the circle. And you have to dip your toe in it into the sort of Hellenistic tutti frutti of classical architecture, because otherwise, I mean, there are many other ways of doing it. One's learned, because I've had so many architects, old modern architects, telling me how to do things. I now realize that it's best not to tell people how to do students and just allow them to because that's really what the important thing is to just really pay a lot of attention to the past and really go humbly back into the past and look hard at it, and because there's an awful lot to learn. And
so this is the last area. So that's the last thing that I want to talk to you, ask you about is your design process. Now I see you are sat here in what I am assuming is a painter's frock.
It's a smock.
Yeah.
I said
smock. I said frock. I meant to say frock.
It's a flowing robe.
It's a flowing robe. It's very beautiful. And I suppose one of the part of the mystique of the classical architecture, or say, for example, the classical architecture has moved beyond pastiche and into an authentic representation of traditional languages of architecture.
Yeah.
There's a mystique around actually how it's done. Like, I mean, I'm not talking about, do you sit at a computer? We all have to have computers. But like, how do you, when you are presented with a project, with a brief for a project, how do you begin? Where do you start?
Well, when I was a younger architect, I used to always try and force my poor old project and my poor old client, my poor old site into something that I wanted it to be. Now I rely on the sort of 43 years that I've had of looking and thinking and making, and I try to go to the drawing board, and literally the drawing board, because the reason why I wear a smock is because I draw a lot. So I get charcoal and pencil all over my hands all the time. And so I like to go to the drawing board completely with a open heart, but no preconceived ideas about what I'm going to do. I then just simply look at the site. I look at the program, the requirements, what's required. And I start sketching very, very small, usually in a sketchbook, tiny little sketches. And I try not to have any preconceived ideas, and I then wait for what I call guests to arrive at the table. And sometimes they are guests that I've met before, and sometimes they're totally uninvited guests. And I'm surrounded always in both my library here and in my office by my dead heroes by way of books, and then an idea will come to me that I ought to look at something, and then I'll go and find it, and that will lead to something else, and then so it sort of develops. But I discovered the best thing to do is to just not try too hard. And that sounds a difficult thing to do, but when I was younger, I tried desperately hard, and I always realized that I'd gone entirely down the wrong route. So now I wait for something to come to me. I then follow that, and I usually end up somewhere else. But I'm as I'm designing, I'm constantly thinking, oh, well, that reminds me of Plečnik in Prague at the castle. Or where have I seen that before? It's sort of trying to get on the page what you haven't seen, but that you want to see. And you need lots of help with that. You need your books, you need your sketchbooks, your own thoughts, which are really helpful from the past. And then obviously all the reference books that one's built up over the years. And then it's a question of not punishing yourself too much as you design, that you don't beat yourself up all the time. Oh, that's dreadful. Just, I try and allow it to sort of emerge. My great friend Alexander Stoddard tells this story of when he designed the maquette, the sort of bozzetto, the little model. You can see some of them behind me here, from which is the beginning, the kernel of a sculptural project. And he tells a story on Christmas morning. It happened to be Christmas morning when he was designing the little model of the seated figure of Christ. Because we both have a pact that on Christmas morning we work for a few hours before the family get up. And because we're both Protestants and we both, have the sort of work ethic. Anyway, he's working and thought he would begin modeling the seated figure of Christ. And he then goes into a sort of trance where he comes out and he's late for the Christmas lunch, but this model has emerged and he cannot honestly remember the time that he spent. It's a sort of form of meditation, really. And so I think design is as close as we can get to Buddhist meditation of some sort, when you get into that sort of zone of not being consciously conscious of what you're doing, but being fully aware of what the moment and all that you've sort of imbibed in the past. I mean, it sounds all it's not mysterious, but it comes out of a lot of hard work and a lot of looking, so you can trust your instincts and you don't have to be worrying all the time. But, I draw by hand, not to scale to begin with. Increasingly, because I've drawn for so long, my sketches are pretty much to scale. 1 to 200 is very, very useful, very tiny. And then I can quickly go up to bigger in my sketchbook until it reaches the limits of the sketchbook, which is about that size. And then I can begin drawing on the drawing. I draw freehand to start off with, and then I'll do little 3-dimensional sketches at the same time. And all of our work comes from that beginning, and then I'll hand it over to a young architect who will begin drawing it up in computer. On the computer. I don't draw on the computer, I'm embarrassed to say. And the joy of drawing is my greatest joy. I actually love the activity of drawing. It's my way of thinking. I think through my pencil. I allow my pencil to Michael Reardon always used to say, why do you draw so much? You just draw and draw and draw. I say, well, I'm drawing to try and understand what I want to see. I can't see it in my mind's eye. I'm not one of those architects that can see it, and I'm not sure there are that many people that can actually see everything in their mind's eye. So I used to draw vigorously. Now I draw calmly, and then something emerges. And by layering one piece of tracing paper over the other, suddenly something emerges between the layers. Oh, that's something. It's shape making and looking. That it's a perceptive thing. It's not an intellectual. My design experience it comes out of the actual percept, the vision of what's coming out of the page, and then I recognize some. Oh, that looks like the Laurentian Library or whatever. Maybe I should go with that, and then I'll go and So it's not mysterious at all. Sometimes it comes very quickly. More frequently, it comes much quicker now, because I don't try and force something on the page. It sort of comes like a flower. And
they're very beautiful. I mean, it sounds almost like sort of a composer of music, a sort of arvo pet, like laying it down and watching it emerge in a strange kind of way.
Yeah. I mean, I love Arvo Pärt's music. I don't know much about how he works, but
neither do I. This is the feeling I get when I listen to his work. That is a very organic kind of.
Yeah, I think it. It's improvisation. I think it's like Bach. I mean, I listen to a lot of Bach, and I know very little about music, but it is about taking a very small motif and then building it into a great symphony. And that's really how classical architecture works is that you take the diameter of the column and then you will do all sorts of things with it. You'll make it, so many diameters apart, so many diameters tall to make a column. Then each part is an element of that. But it's how you, it's how you, when you compose a tall, I've just finished designing a tower for a project in America, and that has a base and a shaft and a top. So it's a bit like three movements of a classical piece of music, where you introduce the motif in the beginning, and you play with it a bit, and then you have this long period of rest in the middle, which is the shaft, and then you reintroduce the original motif at the top. But by the time you've got there, you've traveled a long way. You've changed and the motif has changed. So I find these kind of analogies when I'm designing really quite helpful to allow your I think the way of improvising in music is actually very helpful to not only classical architects but probably all architects, really, to sort of freewheel a bit with the knowledge that you've got the grounding that you need.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, I don't like to wrap these things up, but there's a word that I'm getting the word that it's inspiring me to think about is the idea of a dialogue, that the design process or architecture is dialogic, speaking to the past, speaking to the future, and a kind of dialogue between, in a way, you and the paper as well.
Yes.
Which I think is a really elegant idea, that the process of design communicates to you that which it wants to be, in a peculiar kind of way. And there is something very comparable in a way to the vernacular tradition in that, this idea of your design work being based in a conversation that preceded you and precedes you as well.
Yeah, that's a very lovely way of summarizing it, I think. Indeed.
Thank you. Well, thank you ever so much, Craig. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Really wonderful.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much as well, Ambrose.
How nice was that? Pretty darn nice, I think you'll agree. Thank you to Craig for submitting himself to my willing ignorance. Please see the podcast description for links to his website and other online material about him and his body of work. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share Ears for Architecture everywhere. Cheers.